Major power outages across Taiwan, an apparent equipment malfunction and the scramble to fix it. Entering a second week of war, more than 1 million people have now fled the fighting in Ukraine. Taking up the cause in Taiwan, people raising money in innovative ways for Ukraine. Plus, another top-level visit, former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's message for Taiwan. A warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. Taiwan is experiencing power outages in many major cities after a reported malfunction in a power plant. Although there are many areas with power restored, some areas, particularly in the south of Taiwan, are still without electricity. Officials are racing to get the power back on. Jaime Ocon reports.
As many people in Taiwan headed to work, traffic lights and commuter trains all came to a sudden stop. At around 9 a.m., Taiwan experienced a widespread power outage affecting 30% of the country's electric output. As of midday, among the areas without power, several districts in Taipei and large sections in the south of the country. That's over 5 million households. According to Taipower, Taiwan's state-run power company, the outage was caused by equipment malfunction at the Xingda power plant in the southern city of Kaohsiung. Officials were quick to assure the public that they were taking the necessary steps to get the power back on.
那我们在第一时间就赶快成立了应变中心，那包括经济部包括台电等等，我们就紧急来处理这个事情。那对这样的大停电呢，我们特别感到抱歉，跟大家致意那造成特别是南部非常的不方便特别感到深深的歉意。
Officials, however, have stressed that it would take some time for Taiwan's power supply to fully be restored. As Nae Zhou and Jaime Ocon for TaiwanPlus.
An emergency meeting of the UN General Assembly has voted to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, calling on Moscow to immediately end hostilities. The vote comes as the UN says the week-old conflict has killed more than 700 civilians and forced more than 1 million to flee. James Chater reports.
Delegates at the UN rise to their feet as they vote overwhelmingly to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The non-binding resolution calls for an immediate withdrawal of Russian troops and an end to the attack, which the UN now says has killed more than 700 civilians. Only 4 countries, Belarus, Syria, North Korea and Eritrea, joined Russia in voting against the motion. India and China abstained, in line with previous UN motions on the conflict.
The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now. Silence the guns now. Open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now.
But despite the categorical result and a wave of international sanctions already crippling the Russian economy, Moscow's foreign minister is insistent Russia still has allies.
Но у нас есть друзья, у нас есть союзники, у нас есть немало партнеров на международной арене, которые не утратили, в отличие от Европы и некоторых других стран, своей самостоятельности, своей способности руководствоваться своими национальными интересами.
Moscow has escalated assaults on key Ukrainian cities, with devastating shelling continuing in Kharkiv and Kyiv.
Це вже за межею людяності. Такий ракетний удар свідчить, що для багатьох людей в Росії наш Київ абсолютно чужий. Вони нічого не знають про нашу столицю, про нашу історію. Але у них є наказ стерти нашу історію, стерти нашу країну, стерти нас усіх.
The intensifying bombardment of Ukraine's 2 largest cities comes as Russia took control of the southern port city of Kherson, the first major city in the country to fall to Russian forces. Kherson sits between Crimea and the major port city of Odessa. Analysts say this will allow Russia to control more of Ukraine's southern coast and use it to push further north into the country. But as Russia appears determined to continue its assault despite international isolation, those on the ground hold on to hopes for a ceasefire. Patrick Chen and James Chater for TaiwanPlus.
As the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its 8th day, Taiwan is stepping up its efforts to raise funds for the country and people fleeing the violence. Bing Wang reports.
Inspired by the international push to provide humanitarian relief to Ukraine, Chen Junze is volunteering to make Ukrainian flags. His community is selling them, and all proceeds will go to supporting the Eastern European country. The flag sold out almost immediately.
虽然他那个整个经费可能没有办法募到很多，可是我们希望给他们一点点温暖，那鼓励他们的士气。
Chen is one of many people in Taiwan doing what they can to raise funds for Ukraine. This wine merchant is selling 1,800 bottles of Ukrainian cherry wine, while a Ukrainian student in Taiwan is making 1,200 dumplings a day to sell on the internet. The Taiwanese government has set up a special account to accept public donations. And the Foreign Ministry says it will work with Taiwan's representative office in Poland to ensure the donations will be spent on the increasing number of Ukrainian refugees. Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen will be contributing to that fund.
外交部会公布由赈灾基金会设立的援助乌克兰捐款专户。专户成立以后呢，我和赖清德副总统以及苏贞昌院长也将会分别捐出1个月的所得。
Apart from the government fund, Eric Chu, chairperson of the opposition Kuomintang, or KMT, says his party will also be supporting Ukraine aid efforts.
国民党的一级党务主管会捐出1个月所得，来支持乌克兰的医疗所用。我们会透过国际红十字会对于乌克兰地区民众的医疗所需做
Stand with Ukraine. Since the Russian invasion began, there has been an outpouring of support from Taiwan for Ukraine and its people. Taiwanese and their government want it known far and wide that in the face of aggression, it stands with Ukraine and democracy. James Raynor and Bing Wang for TaiwanPlus.
Former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was recognized by the Taiwan government on Thursday for his contributions to deepening Taiwan-U.S. ties. The former top U.S. diplomat was presented with the civilian award, the Order of Brilliant Star, by Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen. Pompeo is in Taipei as part of his first trip to Taiwan. He arrived Wednesday, just a day after a delegation of former U.S. security officials sent by U.S. President Joe Biden. During his term, Pompeo normalized U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and lifted restrictions on visits by top U.S. officials. His remarks at the award ceremony centered on the need for strong democracies, especially amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I think we need only watch what's taking place in Europe today to see that this continues to demand deep, concerted, focused leadership from those of us who cherish freedom.
Earlier, I spoke with Miles Yu, the former China policy advisor to Pompeo, who is part of the visiting delegation. Yu is now a senior researcher at the Hudson Institute. He began by telling me how Pompeo views Taiwan.
Secretary Pompeo sees Taiwan as a shining example of what a free people can do. And so this is one of the reasons why he must feel like a homecoming, because it's not necessarily culturally speaking, but in terms of value and principle.
You were senior policy advisor on China to Mike Pompeo, and the Biden administration has continued a tough stance on Beijing. Could you explain how their policy on Taiwan has changed?
Well, I think, the national consensus in the United States politics on China has been extraordinary, even miraculous, because you don't see this kind of consensus often at all. Across the aisles of the Congress, in all industries, business, academia, and even in government, you see this extraordinary common understanding of the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, not only to the freedom and democracy of the United States, but also to the world. I think what China does really matters. We cannot really do nothing if a Chinese government locked up 1 million plus Uyghurs into concentration camp. That's what happened for decades. We normally don't do protest as vigorously as we did during the Trump administration. Many of the problems in this troubled relationship, they were there for decades. However, we don't have a national leader courageous enough to make the move to actually reverse the direction of U.S.-China relationship. Trade deficit has been going on for a long time. Intellectual property theft by the Chinese has been going on for a long time. China's abuse of human rights has been gross, right, for many, many, many years. So we don't have any effective way to counter, to push back. And I think, this is the one reason why the Trump administration's policy overall is pretty revolutionary in its nature. And that legacy actually is not just the how great we were necessarily, but also it's reflective of the national consensus, the mood. So I don't think, either Biden administration or Trump administration, their policy toward Taiwan, when it comes to the issue of China, I think that both sides agree near 100%. It's not 100%, but nearly 100%. And I'm very pleased to say that.
Secretary Pompeo's trip takes place at a time when there's been much speculation about him running for president in 2024 on the Republican ticket. What can you tell us about this?
That's a good question. I'm going to ask him tomorrow morning, and then I'll tell you later.
Thank you, Miles. And is there anything else that you would like to tell Taiwan?
Let freedom reign. And what Taiwanese people have achieved in the last several decades is absolutely wonderful and marvelous. And I think this also set a good example for all Chinese-speaking communities around the world. Freedom, democracy creates happiness. And Taiwan has recently been ranked as Asia's #1 democracy. That's amazing, coming from the shadow of the past.
As cases of COVID-19 in Taiwan remain stable, the government is gearing up to start relaxing border restrictions. On Thursday, health authorities reported 66 new cases, including 5 new domestic infections. Starting next week, business travellers will be allowed into the country and will have to serve a quarantine of 10 days, a reduced time period that will apply to all travellers. It's the first easing of restrictions for foreign visitors since last May, but authorities say that opening up further may not happen for some time.
欧美的可能性是蛮高的在7月之后不过必然在大解封会伴随着一波的大流行嘛。那这个大解封的脚步我们是不会跟它同步的我们会比它慢一些。
New Zealand police battled anti-vaccine mandate protesters to regain control of Parliament grounds on Wednesday. Authorities towed away cars and dismantled tents, while protesters set fires and hurled debris and abuse. For more than 3 weeks, hundreds of protesters have disabled the centre of New Zealand's capital city, occupying the area in front of Parliament and the surrounding streets. The protesters took inspiration from truckers' demonstrations in Canada, which blocked streets with trucks, cars and motorcycles in a protest that led to violent clashes. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said it was time for the protesters to leave.
We have a difficult journey in front of us to address the underlying cause of what we have seen here today. But in doing so, we will never, ever excuse it. It was an attack on our frontline police. It was an attack on our parliament. It was an attack on our values, and it was wrong.
Coming up, as a former radio host becomes the first person convicted under a colonial-era sedition law in Hong Kong, we speak to the Hong Kongers saving pro-democracy news sites before they are taken down by the government.
我们真的很久没有表演，
走到了一个必须要停下来的状态，
因为我又不会看谱，
就不知道哪来的韵，有些人喜欢。
想想我最擅长的事情好像是玩团。
其实我的歌很多都是在解决我自己遇到的问题。
我通常会发脾气或者是暴怒，是因为不公平。
发现我对舞台是不熟悉的。
诚实的讲述你自己，就会有人听。
我
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. Much is being made of Russia's assault on Ukraine and the parallels with Taiwan's situation. China claims Taiwan as its territory and has not ruled out the use of force to take it. I spoke with J. Michael Cole, a senior non-resident fellow at the Washington-based Global Taiwan Institute, to discuss the crisis in Ukraine and how it relates to Taiwan. He begins with the differences between the two countries.
First of all, from a purely military perspective, Ukrainian forces only have to cross land borders to launch their attacks against Ukraine, whereas in the Taiwan context, Taiwan being an island is surrounded by water. So that definitely complicates any attempt by the Chinese military to take Taiwan by force. Another important element, I would say, is the fact that Ukraine has a sizable number of ethnic Russians, especially in parts of Ukraine that border Russia, who are to a certain extent amenable to Russia's intentions in Ukraine, who may have grievances against the Ukrainian government and somehow believe that they would have a better future if they were ruled by Russia. Now, Taiwan does not have that kind of sizable ethnic minority that would to the same extent, collaborate with invaders. We certainly have a number of individuals and small organizations in Taiwan that are pro-unification, but nowhere near the extent that we've seen in Ukraine.
And you've also talked about the significance of Taiwan, sort of geopolitically, economically.
In terms of certainly in recent years as well, the importance of Taiwan to the global supply chain, its leadership in semiconductor industry that has worldwide implications, but also the geographical location of Taiwan in an extremely important sea transit in East Asia, which means that any military activity in the Taiwan Strait and the kind of denial of access that the Chinese military would have to impose would have near catastrophic repercussions for global trade, which means that not to downplay the significance of Ukraine for European security, but from a purely global perspective, I would argue that contingency in the Taiwan Strait would have much greater implications, would be all the more destabilizing to the global economy. And I think countries like Taiwan, United States, and their like-minded allies could do more as well to make people worldwide realize that an attack on Taiwan would have real hard consequences for their livelihoods.
Still, what lessons, if any, should Taiwan be taking from Ukraine?
One big lesson, certainly, and I've noticed that quite a few people in Taiwan have taken note of that, is the fact that even in the face of extraordinary odds, if there is a whole of society response to this type of invasion, if people are playing different roles in defending their territory, defending their way of life, their democracy, they can make the lives of invading forces a lot more difficult. I think this serves as a very potent example for the Taiwanese, and that it is also their responsibility and that of the government to make sure that everybody plays a role in contributing to deterrence against these type of attacks, but also if indeed an attack occurs, to know what to do and to have access to different means and tools to make the lives of invading forces a lot more difficult. This is a great example of unity, of resistance, and I sure hope that the Taiwanese are inspired by what we're seeing in Ukraine right now.
A former radio host and democracy activist in Hong Kong has been found guilty of sedition amid the city's ongoing crackdown on political dissent. Tam Tak Chi, also known as Fast Beat, was convicted on 11 counts of sedition. He was not tried under the national security law imposed by Beijing in 2020, but rather under a colonial-era law that originally targeted offences against the British Crown. Tam's is the first sedition trial in Hong Kong since its return to China in 1997. Tam was found guilty on 7 charges of uttering seditious words, including the popular protest slogan, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times." More and more media workers and news outlets have found themselves caught in the crosshairs of the Hong Kong security law that was imposed by Beijing nearly 2 years ago. As the Hong Kong government has cracked down on pro-democracy media, major news sources have disappeared, along with years of reporting. But some are fighting to preserve this material before it's gone. Ryan Ho-Kilpatrick has this story.
Search for the biggest opposition newspapers and websites in Hong Kong, and this is what you'll find. Since the imposition of the national security law in 2020, the city's 3 biggest pro-democracy news outlets, Apple Daily, Stand News, and Sedition, have all been shuttered. And when they go down, they take everything with them to try to protect their employees and contributors from the government's crackdown. Overnight, years or even decades of reporting are lost forever. Or at least they would be, if not for volunteer archivists and groups like the 852 Spirit that rush to back it all up. For their safety and their families, they asked not to be identified on screen.
Programs that Hong Kong journalists dedicated their passion and effort in investigative journalism. We can only imagine how much sleep the staff had lost while preparing programs like that for the public. So preserving their work is preserving the truth, which is what we do. We cannot simply make those programs once they're gone.
These volunteers are members of the Hong Kong diaspora scattered around the globe, and they feel that protecting and passing on their hometown's collective memory is a service they're uniquely placed to make.
It's safe for us to hold these things, and they're not going to get erased or removed like, say, what's happening in the bookstores or the public libraries in Hong Kong. We can hold these things in trust. Generations of people have lost their memories and events and evidence.
The absence of evidence in China for the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre provides a cautionary tale in how governments with absolute control over the media and education can erase or rewrite historical events.
I mean, you only have to look at 89 to see how the events were suppressed there and the activists were told that it never happened. Yes, we saw this. We remember it. We've saved it. We believe your stories. We've seen your stories.
But this isn't just about helping future generations. The government and police are aggressively prosecuting activists who took part in pro-democracy protests. And in some cases, live-streamed footage has proven that police testimony was false.
Live-streamed videos have become crucial evidence in court to prove that the accused isn't guilty or present at the scene of the crime. It's hard to prove someone's innocence unless there is convincing evidence to present to the judge. Whereas news articles, interviews, or other materials, they are priceless because those are someone else's work of which they gave the best effort in documenting the city's history.
The anti-government protests of 2019 and 2020 inspired a deluge of art, writing, music, and film. But in Hong Kong itself, now under the wide-ranging national security law, little of it can be safely shared. The award-winning documentary Revolution of Our Times is now playing to sold-out audiences worldwide, but is banned in the city it documents. Another item on a growing list of examples of how authorities are seeking to limit not only what Hong Kongers are allowed to report on and talk about, but even what they are allowed to remember. But the 852 Spirit and others are pushing back. They say they're in the early stages of creating an online database where anyone can access the materials they save. As Hong Kongers increasingly lose control over how their home is run in the present and what course it takes in the future, they are determined to prove they will not have their past, their memories, taken away from them. Ryan Ho-Kilpatrick for TaiwanPlus.
God bless them. Australia is bracing for even more rain as the weather system bears down on Sydney. At least 14 people have been killed by record flooding in recent days. About 500,000 people are now under evacuation orders in New South Wales. The Australian Bureau of Meteorology has issued several severe weather warnings in the area. Thousands of volunteers are contributing to clean-up and recovery efforts. Delegates at the annual UN conference in Nairobi have passed an historic agreement aimed at ending plastic pollution around the globe. 175 countries attending the UN Environmental Assembly endorsed the resolution that will establish a legally binding global agreement by 2024. It will tackle the production, design and disposal of plastics that now pollute the world's oceans, rivers and landscapes. The UN calls it the most significant environmental accord since the Paris Climate Deal of 2015. Taiwan's Baseball League could be adding a new team to its roster. The Chinese Professional Baseball League announced a collaboration with Taiwan Steel Group to establish a sixth baseball team, which could start playing in 2024. The team will be named the Taiwan Steel Brave Eagles, with a home in Kaohsiung's Chengqing Lake Stadium in southern Taiwan. On Tuesday, Taiwan Steel Group Chairman Xie Yuming signed a letter of intent with League Commissioner Cai Qi-chang. The application still needs approval by the CPBL board, which meets in May. Thank you for watching TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. We leave you with pictures of a massive puppet porcupine, billed as the world's largest, that was unveiled in Los Angeles in the US. For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, please download the TaiwanPlus app. Stay safe and see you next time.